Hello again, and welcome to video number 7 in our new unit on the formation of the Canadian Federation. Today's essential question is, what political and economic changes led toward Canadian Federation? In order to answer the essential question, you're going to have to be able to meet certain success criteria, which include identifying the two political groups established in United Canada in the 1850s and the political tension between them. Second, you're going to have to identify the effects of free trade policies. Third, you're going to have to be able to identify the main elements of the Confederation project. We're going to be covering a lot of material today, so let's get started. Okay, so our essential question is, what political and economic changes led toward the Canadian Federation? So before we answer that, let's first just look where we left off last video. So if you remember last video, politically, in 1848, a responsible government was finally put into play, and it was led by an alliance between Baldwin and LaFontaine, who were the respective leaders of the moderate reformers in both Canada West and East. Well, the thing to keep in mind is that in 1851, these two gentlemen, their alliance is broken because of a burning of the Parliament in 1849. Basically, the burning took place because the government passed a law stating that French Canadians who basically lost everything during the rebellions would be granted reparations, which is basically like a financial compensation for everything they had lost. This really upset a lot of English people, and so there was a huge riot to the point that people believed that they were bending to the will of the French, and people got very nervous, and it led to a riot and ultimately the burning of the Parliament building. It's actually kind of interesting because at this time the Parliament building wasn't in Ottawa, so when it got burnt down, there was a little bit of flux, meaning change, that took place, and there was a couple of parliaments that were being built, but ultimately it was decided that Ottawa would be the capital and the location of the Parliament buildings once it was rebuilt. All right, so back to our essential question. So basically the big political change, guys, that occurred at this time was a new system was put in place, and it was called the two-party system. So we've seen that word party quite a bit in this class, and basically what you have here is it was a new political system in which there were only two main political parties, one or the other one which would hold power. So the two groups that exist at this time are the Conservatives. This is one political group. And the second political group are the Liberals. So this new system of government basically meant that only one of these two political groups could hold the majority of the power at any given time. So in Canada West, you had a leader called John Macdonald, and he was the leader so Canada West was led by John Macdonald. And in Canada East, the Conservatives were represented by a man known as Georges-Étienne Cartier. So those were the two leaders of the Conservative Party. The two leaders of the Liberal Party, so first in Canada West, the Liberal leader was a man known as Brown, George Brown. And the Canada East leader was represented by a guy named Antoine-Aimé Dorion. So these were the leaders, okay? And the way it works now is basically you have a majority and a minority government. So in Canada West, the government that was in the majority was actually the Liberals. And in Canada East, the majority government was led by the Conservatives. So at this point, the thing to take away is that there is now a new system of government in place called the two-party system. You were either Conservative or you were part of the Liberal Party. Okay, finally, the last thing that I just want to talk about in terms of politics is there was a little bit of a dispute going on in government between the two political groups. Specifically, the leader George Brown, he was the leader of the Liberals in Canada West, which at that time held a majority of the government there. He proposed this idea of proportional representation in government. It's called rep by pop. Okay, it's called rep by pop. And representation by population basically meant that the higher your number of population, so the more people you have, the more representation you should have in government. Obviously, people who supported him really liked this idea because it would grant them greater strength in the House of Assembly, and people living, specifically people who were French Canadian, felt that proportional representation or rep by pop would endanger their culture and language. So you couldn't really get an agreement on this, and so there was a bit of a stalemate, as they call it, where neither group will agree on it. So many politicians hoped that there would be a reorganization in the colony politically. Okay, so let's look at one of the major economic change that led to Canadian Federation. So something that happened at that time was called free trade policy. If you think back to last class, we discussed how the abandonment of protectionism by Great Britain really impacted the colony. And so when protectionism was abandoned, free trade policy was put in place. Free trade policy is basically that Great Britain could now import materials from all countries, not just the colonies inside Great Britain's kingdom. So the fact that free trade policy was put in place had significant impacts. One of the impacts that it had was, if you can look down here, the Reciprocity Treaty that was signed. And the Reciprocity Treaty that was signed took place between the United Canada and the United States. So once Great Britain abandoned protectionism and went into free trade policy, you now saw United Canada look to the United States to become its major trading partner. The Reciprocity Treaty basically took off a tax that would have been charged prior to free trade policy. And basically, for 12 years, Canada and the United States did business, trading raw materials at a huge rate, okay? But what happened was United Canada, after 12 years, began to get a little bit worried because it was becoming too dependent on the United States to sort of provide for its economy. And so what Canada tried to do was develop its own internal market so that it would do some trade even within its own colony to create a large enough economic unit to sustain itself. Another thing to keep in mind at that time was that because protectionism was abandoned and free trade policy was put in place, you think back to when the colony was sending raw materials to Great Britain, and in return, Great Britain would send manufactured goods back to the colony. Well, now, because they didn't have that to rely upon, they had to the colony had to start creating its own manufactured goods or finished products. One of the big ones was shoes. This image here is actually of the Fogarty and Brothers shoe factory in Montreal. And so things like footwear, textiles, food, steel, iron, things like that were being now manufactured, okay, in the colony and staying sort of, in the colony. So that was called the creation of the manufacturing sector. So that was another impact or effect of free trade policy. The third impact was called the first phase of industrialization. So industrialization occurred in major urban centers. This is where the majority of the population would live, in these big cities. And industrialization was sort of the creation of huge factories. You can see in this image by the smokestacks here in Montreal that the creation of factories was caused by a huge increase in technology. Look at this image here and you can see the amount of technology that is being created on the left and right. Look at this machinery. So basically industrialization had basically less specialized workers using big machinery to create products as quick as possible. And finally, the last effect or impact of free trade policy was the creation of an extensive, or I should say the expansion of an extensive railroad network. Here you have an image of people creating a railway system, and this was because of how much business was going on between the United States and United Canada. They needed to invest in a railroad system that would allow them to send manufactured goods as well as raw materials down to the U.S. Some of the reasons for railroad systems being expanded on were rapid access to raw materials, the manufacturing of manufactured goods, year-round access among British colonies, which before that they relied so much on boats, but with bad weather, sometimes they would be iced in. It also allowed them to open new territories for colonization. And so some of these are the reasons, or sorry, some of these are the impacts of free trade policy. So this is an economic change that took place at that time. Okay, so because of all the political and economic changes that took place in the British colony, you now began to see this talk of perhaps unifying Canada into its own federation. So there were a number of reasons for it. One was because of the relationships with the United States. In 1866, Canada decided to the United States, I apologize, decided not to renew its reciprocity treaty with United Canada because there was conflicts going on at that time caused by the American Civil War. However, there was something called the Great Coalition in 1864 that was put in place. And if you think back to the conservative and liberal leaders that I talked about a few moments ago, you now began to see an alliance being formed between Macdonald and Cartier, who were the leaders of the conservative parties in Canada West and East. So that alliance created what they called the Great Coalition. And the Great Coalition was between, like I said, Macdonald and Cartier, and together they put in the Great Coalition. The Great Coalition, its ultimate goal, okay, the goal of it was the idea of confederation. And what confederation means is it's an association of all the number of states or provinces and territories into a central government. So that would be like taking Canada West, Canada East, the Maritimes, like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and taking all provinces combine power to a central government, meaning one government that governs everybody. And that was what the Great Coalition wanted to do. Thanks for watching video number 7. Before going, let's just quickly recap our essential question and success criteria. Our essential question was what political and economic changes occurred that led to the Canadian Federation. And our success criteria were identifying the two political groups established in United Canada in the 1850s and their political tension between them. We had to be able to identify the effects of free trade policy, and finally to identify the main elements of the Confederation project. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.